When I opened the door that afternoon, I never imagined my life would change forever. A man I had never seen before stood there, wearing a smile that didn't quite belong on his face. He said he just wanted to know who lived there, but something in his eyes made me feel like he already knew, like he had been watching me for days. That was the first time I saw him, but it wouldn't be the last. And what happened after still haunts me. It all began when my sister decided to go on a week-long trip. I stayed behind, thinking it would be a good chance to enjoy some peace and quiet. It was Monday morning when she left, and with the day off, I spent my time tidying up the house and relaxing. But around 2 p.m., there was a knock at the door. When I heard the knock again the following day, my stomach sank. It was around 6 p.m., and I had just returned home from work. The familiar sound of knuckles against the wooden door filled the quiet house, but this time, I hesitated before answering. I peeked through the peephole, and there he was again, the same man from the day before, wearing the exact same clothes, his expression as unsettling as it was the first time. I cracked the door open slightly, just enough to see him but not enough to make myself vulnerable. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice tinged with the nervousness I was trying to hide. His smile widened, almost mockingly, as if my question amused him. "Of course," he replied, in a tone that made it clear he thought I was overreacting. Then he added, "I was just checking in on you." The way he said it, like he was someone I should expect to see, sent chills down my spine. I tried to rationalize it, asking, "Are you a neighbor of mine?" hoping to ground the bizarre encounter in some kind of logical explanation. But his response shattered any comfort I was grasping for. "Oh no," he said casually. "I wish. Just walking around." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to close the door. I mumbled something about being fine and shut it firmly, leaning against it for a moment to steady my breathing. I waited until I heard his footsteps retreat down the porch before peeking out through the window. He was walking away, but slowly, almost reluctantly, as if he was leaving on his own terms and not because I had ended the conversation. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby. I texted my sister, asking if she had ever seen him before, hoping for a simple answer that would ease my mind. But her reply only made me more uneasy. "No, never. Are you okay?" I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, I was safe inside my home with the doors locked. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house made me jump, and my mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What did he want? Why had he come back a second time? The night passed without incident, but I barely slept. And even though I didn't see him again the next day, the weight of his presence lingered, like an invisible shadow that refused to let me feel at ease. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. It was my day off, and I was determined to make the most of it. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that normally brought me comfort. My sister was still away, and with no work to worry about, I spent the day indulging in simple pleasures, reading a good book, binge-watching YouTube videos, and enjoying the tranquility of having the place all to myself. But as the sun began to set, and the warm hues of daylight faded into the cold shadows of evening, that uneasy feeling crept back in. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was being silly, but every so often, I found myself glancing out the windows, scanning the empty yard and dimly lit street. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. Around 8 p.m., I was settled on the couch watching TV when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something brushing against the side of the house. My heart stopped for a moment as I froze, ears straining to catch the noise again. There it was, louder this time, like a stick dragging along the siding. I jumped up and rushed to the nearest window, yanking the blinds open. The bush just below the window was shaking, and though it was dark outside, I could faintly hear hurried footsteps moving away. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with questions. Had someone been crouching by the house? Watching me through the window? How long had they been there? A nauseating wave of fear washed over me. My hands trembled as I tried to process what I had just witnessed. Surely it was the same man. It had to be. But what was he doing? And why? I grabbed my phone and called my sister. She answered almost immediately, her voice groggy but concerned. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words spilled out in a jumble, too fast for her to keep up. She told me to calm down and assured me it was probably nothing, maybe a stray animal or kids playing pranks. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew better. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't loud or frantic but deliberate, each knock spaced just enough to keep me on edge. My sister's voice on the phone became muffled background noise as I stared at the door, paralyzed with fear. My stomach churned as the knocks grew louder, more insistent. And then I heard his voice. "Hey, are you okay? I'm hurt. Can you help me?" It was him. I recognized the tone, that unsettling mixture of calm and desperation. I stayed frozen, unable to move, as he continued. "I didn't mean to scare you. I just need some help. Please let me in." The pleading in his voice was unnerving, almost convincing. But the more he spoke, the more erratic he sounded, switching between apologizing and trying to guilt me into opening the door. "I know I've been weird. I'm sorry. I just want to talk. Please." My sister, now fully awake and alarmed, yelled through the phone. "Call the police right now! Don't open the door!" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and hung up to dial 911. As I shakily explained the situation to the dispatcher, the man kept pounding on the door, shouting things I couldn't make out. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, the noise stopped. I stayed by the door, holding my breath, until I was sure he was gone. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no sign of him. That night, I sat in the living room with every light in the house on, clutching a kitchen knife, and jumping at every sound. Sleep was impossible. Even though the man was gone, his presence lingered like a dark cloud, suffocating and unrelenting. What did he want? And more importantly, how long had he been watching me? The night had been eerily silent since the man left, but the damage was already done. My sense of safety was shattered, replaced by an unrelenting paranoia that clung to every thought. I spent the remainder of the evening checking and rechecking every lock, every window, and every corner of the house. Even though the police had assured me they would patrol the area, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself to go to bed, but every time I closed my eyes I could hear the pounding on the door, his voice echoing in my head, desperate and unhinged. "Please let me in!" My heart would race as if I were back in that moment, and I'd bolt upright, gasping for air. Sleep was out of the question. At some point in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion finally took over. I found myself slumped on the couch, clutching my phone in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. Every noise, no matter how small, jerked me back to consciousness. The creak of the house settling, the rustling of leaves outside, all of it felt like signs of his return. As dawn broke, the faint light streaming through the curtains provided a shred of comfort, but it was fleeting. The weight of the night's events lingered, making it impossible to think clearly. I called my sister again, her voice a mix of relief and worry when she answered. "Are you okay? Did anything else happen?" she asked, her concern palpable even over the phone. "No," I replied, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "He's gone, but I just feel like I'm being watched, you know?" She tried to reassure me, promising to cut her trip short and come home as soon as she could. Her words helped, if only a little. Knowing she'd be back soon gave me something to hold on to, a light at the end of this nightmare. That day, I avoided going near the front door or looking out the windows. Instead, I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that he could return at any moment. Every sound outside made me jump. Was it just the wind, or was it him? By the time night fell again, I was a mess. The fear that had gripped me the previous night was now magnified. I had double-checked all the locks and left every light on, but the house still felt too quiet, too vulnerable. I sat in the living room, my eyes darting between the windows and the door, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as I started to think I might make it through the night without incident, there was a soft, deliberate knock at the door. My blood ran cold. It was him. It had to be. Every instinct screamed at me to stay silent, to pretend I wasn't home, but my body betrayed me. My breathing grew heavier, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped my phone. I clutched it tightly, ready to call the police again if necessary. But this time, there was no voice, no desperate pleas. Just silence, stretching out for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. I stayed frozen in place for hours, listening, waiting, until exhaustion finally claimed me. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, I realized I had survived another night. But the question remained, for how long? As the sun rose the next day, the warmth of daylight should have brought relief, but the tension from the previous nights lingered heavily in the air. Every corner of the house seemed to hold the remnants of fear, the shadows a stark reminder of what had transpired. I busied myself, trying to shake off the unease, but every task felt mechanical, as if I were merely going through the motions. I decided to step outside to catch some fresh air, hoping it might clear my mind. The neighborhood appeared so normal, so serene, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My eyes scanned the street, lingering on parked cars, unfamiliar faces walking by, and every possible hiding spot. I wasn't just observing, I was searching for him, even though I wasn't sure what I'd do if I saw him again. The previous day's knock replayed in my mind, along with his desperate attempts to get inside. His voice, the way it carried both a plea and a hidden threat, sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder, was it all random? Or had he planned this, knowing I'd be alone? And what had changed between his initial visits and his final, desperate attempt? Later that day, I received a call from the police. They informed me that they'd been patrolling the area but hadn't spotted anyone matching the description I'd given. "Let us know if you see or hear anything unusual," the officer said, his tone calm but firm. Their assurance was small comfort. I thanked them and hung up, staring at my phone as though it held the answers I needed. Determined not to let my fear control me, I decided to take more precautions. I visited a nearby hardware store and purchased new locks, a set of security cameras, and even a small personal alarm. Installing the cameras around the house felt like taking back some semblance of control, though I couldn't help but feel exposed while doing so. Every car that drove by, every pedestrian that glanced in my direction, made my skin crawl. That evening, as I reviewed the camera footage from the day, I felt a brief moment of peace knowing I could now see who was outside without opening the door. But even this newfound security didn't fully quell my paranoia. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind brushing against the windows, kept me on edge. Then, just as the clock ticked past midnight, I received a text from my sister. She was on her way back, and the thought of her return was a lifeline in the sea of fear I was drowning in. "Hang in there," she wrote. "I'll be home soon." Yet as comforting as her message was, I couldn't shake the nagging question that had plagued me since this ordeal began. Why had he chosen me? What had he seen or thought that made him target my house, my sanctuary? And the most terrifying thought of all, was he still out there, waiting for the next opportunity? As the final night approached, an eerie calm settled over the house. The quietness felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, scanned the footage from the newly installed cameras, and left no corner of the house unexamined. Everything seemed secure, yet the unease in my chest wouldn't subside. It was as though I could feel the weight of unseen eyes, even though I was alone. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, playing soft music in the background to drown out the silence. But every so often, my gaze would dart toward the windows, my ears straining to catch the faintest sound. The hours passed agonizingly slowly, each minute dragging into an eternity. Then, sometime after midnight, the sound came, a faint, almost imperceptible tapping. My body froze as I tried to locate the source. It wasn't coming from the front door this time. The sound was softer, more deliberate, like someone testing the boundaries, seeing how far they could go without being noticed. My heart raced as I moved toward the nearest window, careful not to make any noise. I peeked through the blinds, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I saw nothing but the stillness of the street. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. A shadow darted between the trees lining the sidewalk, quick and deliberate. Whoever it was, they were trying to avoid the cameras. My stomach churned at the realization. They knew about the cameras. They'd been watching. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone to call the police. My voice was barely steady as I explained the situation, detailing the shadowy figure and the faint tapping. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone over immediately, but those few minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. Then, another sound, a low, scraping noise like something being dragged along the side of the house. I held my breath, listening intently as it moved from one wall to the next, slowly circling the house. My mind raced with questions. Was this the same man as before? Was he alone? And what would he do if he realized I was inside, awake and aware of his presence? The scraping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the back door. My eyes darted to the live feed from the cameras, but the shadow lingered just out of view, as though he knew exactly where to stand to remain hidden. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tension, and I felt a rush of relief. The footsteps retreated quickly, fading into the night as the flashing lights of a police car pulled up to the curb. I watched as the officers scanned the area with flashlights, their voices breaking the oppressive silence. One of them knocked on the door, and I cautiously opened it, explaining everything that had happened. The officers found no one, but they did discover faint footprints in the dirt near the back door, leading toward the trees. "Whoever it was, they were definitely here," one of them said. "We'll patrol the area through the night, but stay alert. If you notice anything else, call us immediately." After they left, the house felt emptier than ever. The quiet was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. I locked every door and window again, checked the cameras one last time, and sat in the middle of the living room, clutching my phone. Sleep was out of the question. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, marking the end of the longest, most terrifying night of my life. As dawn broke after that restless and nerve-wracking night, I was met with an overwhelming sense of exhaustion and unease. The light streaming through the windows should have brought relief, but instead, it illuminated the lingering questions and fears that refused to leave my mind. I spent the early morning hours replaying every sound, every shadow, every second of the previous night, searching for some clue that might explain what had happened, or what could happen next. With a cup of coffee in hand, I stood at the back door, staring out at the yard that now seemed less like a safe haven and more like a vulnerable, exposed space. The faint scuff marks in the dirt where the footprints had been found remained visible, a haunting reminder of how close this intruder had been. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't gone, that he was still watching, waiting for another opportunity. Determined to reclaim some semblance of control, I decided to install more security measures. I spent hours setting up additional cameras, motion-activated lights, and window alarms. Each task kept my mind busy, distracting me from the growing paranoia that threatened to consume me. Yet, even with these precautions, a part of me couldn't trust that it would be enough. As I worked, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't random. The way he avoided the cameras, the deliberate movements, it all felt calculated. It was as if he knew the layout of my home, as if he had been watching for longer than I realized. The thought made my skin crawl. How long had I been living under this silent observation? And why had he chosen my home? Later that day, I received a call from one of the officers who had responded the night before. They hadn't found any further evidence of the intruder, but they assured me they'd keep a close watch on the area. Sometimes these people are opportunists, the officer said, his tone attempting to be reassuring. They see a chance and take it, but they don't usually stick around when they know someone's aware of them. It should have comforted me, but it didn't. This didn't feel like opportunism. It felt personal. As night approached, I found myself dreading the coming darkness. Every shadow, every creak of the house, every gust of wind became a potential threat. The fear wasn't just about what had already happened, it was about what could still happen. I kept the lights on, the blinds drawn, and my phone within arm's reach, ready to call for help at the slightest hint of danger. But the night passed without incident. No knocks at the door, no sounds outside, no shadows moving in the yard. By the time the sun rose again, I almost began to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Yet, deep down, I knew better. Something about this wasn't finished. And as much as I wanted to move on, to convince myself that the danger had passed, a part of me remained on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The following days were marked by a mix of hypervigilance and reluctant acceptance. Life seemed to edge back toward normal, but the events of that week had left a scar on my sense of safety. Every routine act, walking to the mailbox, running errands, even sitting on the couch, was now tinged with unease. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. My sister returned from her trip, blissfully unaware of the tension that had gripped our home in her absence. I filled her in on everything that had happened, from the strange man's first knock to the eerie tapping sounds outside and the police's involvement. Her reaction was a mix of concern and disbelief. "That's insane," she said, her voice low and serious. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I shrugged, feeling both justified and regretful. "I didn't want to ruin your trip. And honestly, I thought it might stop after the police came." We agreed to keep every door locked at all times and to double down on security measures. My sister suggested we get a dog, thinking a large, intimidating presence might deter anyone from trying something like this again. It was an idea I hadn't considered, but it made sense. Anything that could provide an added layer of protection, and maybe even some peace of mind, was worth exploring. But even with the added precautions, the memory of that week lingered. The silence of the nights no longer felt calm but oppressive, as though the darkness itself carried the weight of unspoken threats. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar sound, sent my heart racing. The possibility that he might return was a constant shadow, an unwelcome companion in my day-to-day life. A month later, I found myself checking the cameras out of habit. It was a quiet evening, and my sister was out with friends. The footage revealed nothing unusual, just the stillness of the street and the occasional passing car. I was about to turn off the feed when something caught my eye, a figure, standing motionless at the far edge of the yard, just barely within view of the camera. My breath caught, and I froze, staring at the screen as the figure lingered for what felt like an eternity. It didn't move, didn't come closer, but it was there, a chilling reminder that the story wasn't over. The police were called again, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. They reassured me that they'd patrol the area more frequently, but their words did little to ease my growing paranoia. Whoever this was, they knew how to slip away, how to avoid being caught. And they were patient. The fear didn't just affect my nights anymore, it seeped into my days, coloring every aspect of my life. I avoided being home alone whenever possible, filled my schedule with activities to keep my mind occupied, and made excuses not to host friends or family. The house no longer felt like a home, it felt like a trap. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he targeted me. The unanswered questions haunt me just as much as the events themselves. Was it random? Or was there something about me, or my house, that drew his attention? I've tried to move on, to reclaim the sense of normalcy I once had, but the truth is, I don't think I'll ever fully shake the feeling of being watched. Because in the quietest moments, when the world is still and the shadows stretch long, I can't help but wonder, is he still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to return? The weeks following that chilling sighting blurred into a haze of anxiety and hyper-awareness. My sister and I upgraded our home's security system, adding motion-activated floodlights, window alarms, and a reinforced front door. The neighborhood watch group, hearing about my ordeal, became more active, with members committing to late-night patrols. Yet, despite all these measures, the unease lingered. It wasn't just fear of the unknown man anymore. It was the violation of feeling hunted, like my privacy and safety had been ripped away. Every shadow outside the window seemed more menacing, every creak of the house amplified in my mind. Even my sister, usually the calmer of the two of us, confessed to double-checking locks and feeling uneasy when alone. Life went on, albeit with an undercurrent of vigilance. I returned to work, tried to resume hobbies, and kept myself as busy as possible to avoid dwelling on the past weeks. But in the quiet hours, when I was alone with my thoughts, the memory of the man and his unnerving persistence crept back in. I wondered what his intentions had been, if it had been robbery, harm, or something else entirely. Those unanswered questions were the most haunting of all. One evening, while scrolling through local community forums online, I stumbled upon a thread discussing strange occurrences in the area. Several users mentioned encounters with an odd man matching the description of my stalker. He had been seen knocking on doors, asking peculiar questions, and loitering in various neighborhoods. A few even reported finding small, unsettling items left on their porches, broken watches, wilted flowers, or scraps of paper with nonsensical scribbles. I felt a chill run through me as I realized this man wasn't just targeting me. He was active, moving through the community, leaving a trail of fear and confusion. But no one had a clear picture of who he was or what he wanted. The police had received multiple reports about him but hadn't been able to identify or apprehend him. He seemed to vanish just as quickly as he appeared. One post stood out in particular. A woman claimed she had found a crumpled piece of paper tucked into her screen door, with a single phrase scrawled in messy handwriting. "I'll see you soon." That night I barely slept. The idea that this man could still be out there, watching, planning, was unbearable. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage where he could appear at any moment. Every sound outside, whether it was the wind, an animal, or a passing car, made my heart race. I began keeping a journal, writing down every unusual occurrence, every fleeting suspicion. It helped me feel a little more in control, like I was documenting evidence should anything happen again. But deep down, I knew I was simply trying to cope with the overwhelming paranoia. The man had vanished from my life for now, but his shadow lingered. His actions had left an indelible mark on me, turning the mundane into the menacing and leaving me with a haunting question: what happens when he decides to come back? The days turned into weeks, and eventually, the memory of the man began to fade into the background of my life. I convinced myself that perhaps he had moved on or been scared off by the increased security measures and community awareness. My sister and I resumed our routines, cautiously optimistic that the worst was behind us. But that sense of safety was shattered one evening in the most unexpected way. It was a quiet Sunday, and I was at home alone while my sister was out with friends. The autumn wind outside howled against the windows, and the dim glow of the living room lamp provided a cozy ambience. I had just settled onto the couch with a book when my phone buzzed. The notification was from the security system app. "Motion detected front door." My heart sank. I grabbed my phone and opened the app, bringing up the live feed from the camera. At first, there was nothing. Just the empty porch, the shadows of tree branches swaying in the wind. I waited, my breath caught in my chest, convinced it must have been a false alarm. Then, out of the corner of the screen, movement. A figure stepped into view. The same man. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking the unsettling intensity in his posture. He didn't knock this time. He simply stood there, staring at the camera, as if he knew I was watching him. I froze, unsure of what to do. My instinct was to call 911 immediately, but before I could dial, he did something that sent chills through my entire body. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed directly at the camera, at me. Then, he held up a piece of paper, crumpled and weathered, with bold black letters scrawled across it. "I haven't forgotten." The weight of those words crushed any fleeting hope I had that he was gone for good. My fingers trembled as I dialed the police, trying to keep my composure. I whispered my address and explained the situation, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. I kept watching the camera feed as I waited, praying he wouldn't try to break in. But he didn't move closer to the door. Instead, after a few agonizing minutes, he turned and walked off into the night, disappearing beyond the edge of the porch light. The police arrived shortly after, but by then, the man was long gone. They checked the area and took down my statement, but as with the previous encounters, there was little they could do without identifying him or catching him in the act. The note, now in their possession, was the only tangible evidence they had. For the next few days, I barely left the house. My sister and I talked about moving, about finding a place where we could start fresh and leave this nightmare behind. But as much as I wanted to run, a part of me knew that the fear might follow me wherever I went. The man hadn't forgotten, and neither could I. Life slowly began to feel like a precarious balancing act, where every creak of the floorboards and every shadow in the corner of my eye felt like it carried the weight of something sinister. My sister and I did everything we could to protect ourselves: new locks, motion lights, and a high-end security system. We even began to vary our routines, trying to make ourselves harder to predict. But despite all of this, the memory of that man lingered like a shadow we couldn't escape. One quiet evening, I was home alone again. My sister had gone out to dinner with friends, and I was determined to have a peaceful night. I made a cup of tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, and turned on a movie to distract myself. For the first time in weeks, I felt almost normal. That feeling didn't last long. As I sat there, I heard a faint sound, a soft tap on the glass. My heart immediately jumped to my throat. It came again, steady and deliberate. Tap. 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 I muted the television and strained to listen, hoping it was just the wind or some harmless noise. But it wasn't. The sound was coming from the living room window, just behind the couch where I was sitting. I didn't dare turn around right away. My body felt frozen, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it him? Had he come back? Slowly, I mustered the courage to glance over my shoulder. There, on the other side of the glass, was the faint outline of a face. My breath caught in my chest as I realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. Someone was standing there, peering into my living room. I couldn't make out the features clearly, but the posture, the way they leaned into the glass, watching, it was too deliberate to be an innocent passerby. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the police once more. While waiting for the call to connect, I stood up and backed away from the window, trying to keep my movements slow and steady. The dispatcher's calm voice on the other end of the line was a lifeline, but I barely registered her words as I described what was happening. My eyes remained fixed on the window, where the shadowy figure hadn't moved. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they stepped back into the darkness. The faint outline of their face vanished, and I was left staring at the empty glass, my reflection trembling back at me. The police arrived quickly this time, their flashing lights a brief comfort in the stillness of the night. They searched the yard and the surrounding area but found no sign of anyone. However, they did discover footprints leading away from the window, disappearing into the woods behind the house. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's house, unable to sleep, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. Who was it? Was it the man from before, or someone else entirely? And why did they just stand there, watching, without making a move? The questions gnawed at me, leaving a hole where my sense of safety used to be. And as the days turned into nights, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers I so desperately needed were still out there in the dark, waiting. The aftermath of that chilling encounter left an indelible mark on my life. Even as days turned to weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak in the house, every shadow that flickered across the walls, felt like a reminder that the stranger might return. My sister and I decided that staying in the house wasn't an option anymore. The memories of what had happened there were too vivid, too suffocating. We broke our lease and moved out within a month, choosing an apartment in a more populated area, surrounded by people and streetlights, a far cry from the solitude of our old home. It was an attempt to reclaim some sense of security, but the scars of those nights were hard to heal. Even in the new place, I found myself checking the locks multiple times before bed, peering out the windows at the slightest sound. My sister tried her best to move on, but we both knew we'd never feel the same again. What haunted me the most wasn't just the memory of the man at the door or the face at the window. It was the unanswered questions, the unsettling what-ifs, that plagued my thoughts. What did he want? Why had he chosen us? And most terrifyingly, could it happen again? Life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy, but I couldn't ignore the way the experience had changed me. I began taking self-defense classes, carrying pepper spray, and learning to trust my instincts more than ever before. My sister and I grew closer through the ordeal, finding strength in our shared fear and determination to never feel so vulnerable again. To this day, I can't walk past the window at night without remembering the shadowy figure that once stood there, peering into my life like it was some sort of twisted game. I'll never know what might have happened if I had opened that door or stayed in the house any longer. All I know is that I'm grateful for the choices I made, even if they were driven by fear. This story isn't just a memory, it's a warning. Trust your instincts, stay vigilant, and never ignore the feeling that something isn't right. Because sometimes, it's not just paranoia. Sometimes, the danger is real, and it's closer than you think.